Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be sure of this. If the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come." Then Peter said, "Lord, is this parable meant for us or for everyone?" And the Lord replied, "Who then is the faithful and prudent steward, whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food and food allowance at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master on arrival finds doing so. Truly, I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his property. But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delaying in coming,' and begins to beat the men servants and the maid servants, to eat and drink and get drunk, then the servant's master will come on an unexpected day and at an unknown hour, and will punish the servant severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. That servant who knew his master's will but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will shall be beaten severely. And the servant who was ignorant of his master's will but acted in a way deserving of a severe beating shall be beaten only lightly. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more." The Gospel of the Lord. Slavery. That's a word that can be hard for us to accept or view in any way but negatively. Can slavery to anything be good? Well, last night we talked about freedom from sin and death, recognizing that sin does not have to have control over us as long as we have faith in the reality that through the grace of God we can conquer sin. We can be free. But tonight we hear Paul talk about slavery, and that seems like the opposite of freedom. But it's not the kind of slavery that we're talking about. We are tonight talking about freedom from self and how to get there and what it can mean for us in our lives. Paul is writing to people in Rome, and as I mentioned last night, he was addressing a variety of problems and challenges. And a great many of the people he was writing to, maybe as many as 2/3, the way that we understand Rome in Paul's time, as many as 2/3 of those people would have been slaves. And to be a slave meant that your whole life was turned over to a master. There was no time that was your own. It was all owned by someone else. A slave was to be completely committed to his master. So when Paul is writing to the Christians in Rome, they would have had a very clear idea of what he was talking about. Even if they weren't slaves, they knew it meant total, unquestioned, complete commitment. So now Paul draws distinctions for us. Are we going to be slaves to sin, or are we going to be slaves to God? And maybe for some of us, being slaves to anyone, even if it is God, does not sound like a good idea. Yet Paul adds something else. He tells us that when we give ourselves totally, unquestioningly, completely to God, we give up slavery to self and instead accept freedom. Because being a total slave to God only brings us good. It brings us peace. It brings us happiness, completeness. It is a great paradox. So let me tell you another parable. We heard one in the gospel reading tonight. And in the future, and maybe you do this already, whenever you hear Jesus telling a parable, it is necessary for us in listening to this parable to put ourselves inside of it and see how we would compare in our own relationship with God in the listening of that parable. So, this is a parable that is a modern day one. And parables are never supposed to be myths. They're not supposed to be totally fanciful. If you think about the parables that you heard Jesus share with his disciples, you will know that they sound like actual stories. That's the point of them. He's trying to help people in their common everyday lives to place themselves in these stories, like the most famous maybe of all, the story of the parable of the prodigal son. So this is a modern day parable. It takes place about 5 or 6 miles from here, straight down North Avenue towards the city, at the Sedgwick Avenue L stop on the Brown Line. I used to live in Old Town, about a half a block from North Avenue and Wells. I went to Immaculate Conception Church every day. I don't think I went on Saturdays. I wasn't a priest then. I was working downtown Chicago. But at 7 a.m., most days you would find me at daily Mass at Immaculate Conception Church. And then I would walk over to the Sedgwick Brown Line stop, and almost every morning I would see a woman standing there by herself, quiet, waiting, maybe. I was never, for the longest time, sure what she was doing. I thought that she would be asking for money, so I avoided her. I thought maybe she might even smell, so I avoided her. And I didn't know her at all. I never reached out to her. I never asked her if she needed anything, but neither did I ever really see her approaching anyone or asking anyone for someone. She was just this quiet presence every day among the busyness of our lives, going back and forth to the L stop. After this had been going on for several months, one Saturday morning, I was in the local butcher shop. There was a young man, maybe in his mid-20s, named Tony, whose dad owned the store. And he was waiting on me, and we were talking about my getting something for that dinner that night. And in walks this woman, the one who had been at the L stop morning after morning. And it was the first time in all my experience with her that I had ever seen her anywhere but in her spot on the sidewalk outside the L stop. So I was a little startled, and so was Tony. And she walked up to the counter, and she held out her fist, and she opened it, and what fell on the counter was some change and maybe a couple of dollars. Not more than $3, I would say. And this is Old Town. It's expensive. And she says to Tony, "What will that buy?" And Tony turns from me and turns to this woman, and without hesitating, says to her, as a matter of fact, "That's exactly the price of today's special." And so he turns and starts to build a sandwich for her. Not make one. He was building something. And he did it with extra special care. And he used all the imported cold cuts, none of the domestic stuff for this sandwich that he was making for this woman. And as he builds this sandwich and it gets bigger and bigger, her eyes got bigger and bigger. And he finished and he wrapped it up in paper in, I felt, a very special way, as if he was wrapping a present. And he pushes it over to her. And this woman raises her hand over this young man and said, "Today the Lord has made you one of his own." She put her hand down and walked out of the store. And I was stunned. I didn't know what to say at first, and then I said to Tony, "Can I pay for that sandwich?" Not knowing what else I could say at this extraordinary act of selflessness. And he said, "No thanks, I'd rather have the blessing." Here I was thinking I was a pretty good Christian. I was going to Mass regularly. Heck, I was going to Mass every day. But still, I was unable to let go completely of my selfish, sinful ways. I resisted the total commitment that Tony so easily seemed to be able to make. See, in my mind, it seemed like Tony was able to do something that I could not. And in all candor, and I'm a little embarrassed to say, I still have trouble doing. Was I willing to commit myself totally to what God was calling me to do, or was I only willing to go part way? Do I give my life to God totally, or only a piece of it? Do I want to be a slave to God? Can I? Do I have it within me? Well, I don't. I can't. Not without the grace of God. But with the grace of God, I can succeed. You can succeed. What Paul is telling us is that we cannot give a part of our life to God and another part to the world. With God, it is all or nothing. And that's what we see so often in the lives of the saints, giving themselves totally. And it is, brothers and sisters, what every one of us is called to do. A Christian is a man or a woman who has given complete control of their life to Christ, holding nothing back. It is challenging, absolutely, and yet it is not beyond us. Let us each ask through the intercession of St. Jude to help us to give ourselves totally to God and know what real freedom that can be to the people God is calling each of us to be. Let's all be Tonys.